sponsored by the Forest Biodiversity Research Network, the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, Department of Integrative Biology, Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society, Department of Botany and Plant Pathology, and the OSU Research Office. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our EECB seminar speaker, Dr. Charlie Nilon, who is the William J. Rucker Professor in Fisheries and Wildlife in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Missouri. I had the pleasure of meeting Charlie over a decade ago when I was first entering the field of wildlife biology, and I was a young undergrad attending my first conference. Having flown halfway across the country to attend this conference, I didn't know many people, and I certainly didn't know much about research or academic conferences. He was one of the first professionals I met, and talking to him, it was obvious that he was very knowledgeable, but he also instantly made me feel welcome and at ease, and for that, I'm very thankful. Dr. Nilon is a widely respected scholar with more than 90 papers and 6,000 citations, according to Google Scholar. Since 1997, he has been a co-PI on the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, one of the 2 urban ecosystems included in the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research program. He studies how ecological and socioeconomic factors influence wildlife species composition and abundance. And since 2010, Dr. Nilon has been a PI on 3 different synthesis projects that are compiling data from more than 150 cities around the world. Through these projects, he seeks to understand global patterns of biodiversities in cities and apply that information to management, conservation, and planning programs. In 2014, Dr. Nilon was awarded the Ecological Society of America's Commitment to Human Diversity and Ecology Award. He has also co-founded the Ecological Society of America's Environmental Justice Section and helped design the SEEDS program. And with that, I will turn it over to Charlie.
Well, thank you, Marie, and thank you for the really kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the seminar series. And I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there in person, but thank you all for attending tonight. So I'm going to talk tonight about a research area that I'm involved with, but also one that I'm involved with kind of for its interesting application. And that's the links between biodiversity in cities, nearby nature, and then environmental justice. I'm going to be talking about that tonight. And to give you an idea of why I'm talking about that, for about the last 10 years, I've been involved with colleague Mila Aronson at Rutgers University and several other colleagues in 3 different projects that have looked at biodiversity of cities and towns. And these have tried to look at these globally and tried to understand the factors that drive biodiversity in cities, and to look at both the ecological and the social factors which shape patterns of species richness in the composition of the world's cities. And some of the information that we get from projects like this, you could apply to conservation in different places. So I'm going to talk tonight about a project I've been involved in St. Louis. And I say St. Louis City because if you're not from Missouri, you won't know this, but St. Louis is a city, and St. Louis City is a city and a county in Missouri that are separate from St. Louis County. And there's some political reasons, economic reasons, demographic reasons, ethnic, social, racial, all kinds of reasons which are tied in with that. And we're going to talk about that some tonight. But the basic conservation question I'm interested in is that if you go to eBird, it would say that St. Louis City has 266 bird species, and that's probably an underestimate. They're probably around 300. But the question that really might be relevant in conservation is how are those species distributed? And then what are the steps that are important in conserving species? And also what are the steps in allowing people to have a positive interaction with those species? So one of the things we've worked on with these urban biodiversity project has been trying to hypothesize how species pools are assembled in cities. And this is based on Peter Morin's work and about hierarchical filters, and we tried to apply that in cities. And so one of the things which I'm talking about tonight is that if you think about those 266 species of birds in St. Louis City, those have already been filtered by people and their activities, by the life history traits of different species, by habitat features, and so on. So there's a pool of species that occur in St. Louis City. And what I've been interested in as both a sort of applied question, but also a more basic question, is how do things like urban form and history and socioeconomic and cultural factors, how do those act as filters within a city? So part of what I'm going to talk about tonight is thinking about urban form and history and socioeconomic and cultural factors and what shapes that, and then how those might actually shape what species occur in different areas of St. Louis City and the habitats in which they occur, and then also how they might be managed. So the area that I'm thinking about geographically is an area called North City, which if you lived in St. Louis, which I don't, but I've done work in St. Louis, but if you live in St. Louis, people say North City is north of Del Mar, and that's simply a street in St. Louis that's viewed as dividing the northern part of the city. And North St. Louis would be Black St. Louis. It's the area which is now primarily over 90% Black residents. It's an area that has a huge number of social and political issues going on, but it's also a place that has access to a lot of green space, has some really unique places, large number of parks, open space next to the Mississippi River, and so there are a whole range of things going on. And so this is the place where my students and I have been doing some work. And the particular project that we're going to talk about is how bird conservation and environmental justice and nearby nature all fit into a project called the Urban Vitality and Ecology Project. And this is a project that was started about 7 years ago by the city and by the Metropolitan Sewer District. And what you're seeing here is a map that shows all the projects that they're involved with. What's key in all these is what's going to be on the next slide. And so the operational part of this is a project called Green City Coalition. And Green City Coalition is a part of Urban Vitality and Ecology that is jointly sponsored by Missouri Department of Conservation, State Fish and Wildlife Agency, Project Clear, which is part of the Metropolitan Sewer District for St. Louis City and St. Louis County, and then the St. Louis Development Corporation, which is a part of the city of St. Louis. And Green City Coalition is looking at how to manage vacant and abandoned properties, in other words, vacant lots, to develop green spaces that promote healthy, biodiverse, and resilient neighborhoods. So this is a project, it's explicitly designed to address vacant lands in St. Louis, vacant lots, and where those are, and the large majority of those are in North City. So what led to this project is a series of green infrastructure plans that have been developed for 2 neighborhoods in St. Louis. Here you're seeing a map of one of these projects in a neighborhood called Wells Goodfellow, which is the northwest side of St. Louis City. And then the other neighborhood is called Baden, and that's more to the northern edge of the city. But these are both projects where there are a number of green infrastructure plans in place, all of these designed to reduce stormwater runoff, but also designed to create attractive green space for residents and to create wildlife habitats and other features. And all of these are focused on trying to address the problem of having over 3,000 vacant lots in the city of St. Louis. Now, if you're interested in St. Louis and kind of the broader picture of this, what's happening in St. Louis, I'm going to talk about that, but there's an excellent book called Mapping Decline by Colin Gordon, which goes through much of what I'm going to talk about tonight, and also work by Keona Irvin, who's at the University of Missouri, Andrew Hurley, University of Missouri St. Louis, and Gary Kramer from Missouri Historical Society. And they're all people who've done a lot of work and really who I acknowledge for a lot of the work they're doing and helping me with a lot of what's going to be in this talk. So, as I mentioned, I really was interested, my students are really interested in how can you think about, how do you sort of frame bird conservation and urban biodiversity around this kind of project. So there are three ideas that that I'm using to frame this, and they're called everyday nature, popular values of nature, and then environmental justice. And these three things I'm going to use to really look at this idea of sort of everyday nature in Baltimore, and, I'm sorry, in St. Louis, and the role of environmental justice and how this is shaping both birds and birds habitat, but also opportunities for conservation. So to describe these first, everyday nature is based on work done by Rachel Kaplan and Stephen Kaplan, who when they were active were faculty at the University of Michigan. They are environmental psychologists and also involved with landscape design. And they were interested in trying to understand how people become engaged in conservation, how they value nature, and so on. And they recognized that the place within a mile from home, work, et cetera, are the places that people are most familiar with. They're the places that people are the most engaged with around management in cities. And they're also the physical environments they're most engaged with. And those are very much linked to things like preferences and fear. So this idea that everyday nature is the place where people encounter nature on a day-to-day basis, and therefore the places that are most important and where their views about management are most important. And the processes shaping everyday nature are both bottom up and top down processes. So for example, the bottom up processes are things like the legacy that exists from previous landowners. So in most neighborhoods, you deal with the vegetation and the yards and the gardens that you inherited when you bought the house, moved into your property, and so on. It's based on your ability to manage. It's also based on how you perceive nature around you. And the top-down processes are things that local governments do. They do planning and zoning, and in the context of this talk, they have restrictive covenants, they have policies that enforce segregation and so on. And they also have interventions like different approach to management. Now, popular values of nature as it applies to nearby nature and everyday nature really relates to the idea of what do people who are not experts about nature and conservation, how do they value nature? And work on this has been done a lot originally by the people on the top of the picture, Jacqueline Burgess and Carolyn Harrison, and they are folks in University College London who sort of came up with some of this sort of a theory. And then more recently, Teddy Arif and Emily Meritat are two French researchers who looked at this. And they've talked about the idea that there are elite versus popular values, and they mean elite not in the sense of elites holding the values, but more elite in the sense that there are often values that come from education and so on. So conservation, wildlife management, biodiversity, people who are engaged in those have elite values in the sense that those values come often from education, scholarship, and so on. Now, so the popular values, though, what research talks about in this area is that if you ask people how they enjoy the nature around them, they talk about the idea that they enjoy the day-to-day contact with nature. In other words, people encounter nature in day-to-day settings. So the birds they see walking to work, the different kinds of trees they see along the street, that's that sort of day-to-day contact. Second, there's social aspects of nature, and particularly around green spaces, that people go to green spaces where they interact around them socially. They may interact around how they're managed, what happens on them, but there's a social component to that of how they interact with nature in green spaces. And then finally, there are dark sides of nature in that they often capture or often place where people perceive risk, where their fears and where their concerns about safety all come together. So these popular values are really important in understanding conservation in cities as well. And then finally, I tried to frame the work around environmental justice. And environmental justice deals largely with work looking at unequal cost and benefits related to the environment that people either receive or have imposed on them due to race, gender, ethnicity, and so on, particularly in poverty. And they tend to be systemic, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. There's a lot of research now around searching for why these injustices exist and what maintains them. and they're also activists and scholarly traditions around environmental justice. So, for example, Beverly Wright in the top picture is a sociologist at Dillard University in New Orleans, but she's been very active in developing a grassroots initiative to respond to Hurricane Katrina. The bottom picture is Nicholas Hyman at University of Georgia, who again is an environmental justice scholar. So this sort of dual activist and academic focus is going to be really important. Now, in terms of this talk, though, what I'm interested in with this environmental justice framework is what created the system of vacant lots in St. Louis and what may be maintaining it. So, and how that's relevant to bird conservation in these two neighborhoods. So what I'm interested in is first, the role of residents, local governments, real estate associations, federal policy, banks, different city ordinances, formal and informal approaches to restricting how land is used, practices by real estate agents, mortgage insurance, urban renewal, planning and design. All of these things create a system that maintained a certain pattern of land use in the city and where people live in the city, and then how that's had an outcome in terms of both people's access to nature, their experience with nature, and opportunities for conservation. So in this case, the environmental justice issue I'm looking at in St. Louis would be what created the current pattern of places in North City where residents encounter nature and wildlife, and particularly how that's tied to restricting where Black residents could live. So to start out thinking about St. Louis, this is actually a map showing the same perspective of St. Louis that is pretty typical. So this was pre-Gateway Arch because it's from 1934, but at the center bottom of the picture would be where the arch is in St. Louis. And then you're looking pretty much the north would be the west side of St. Louis City. So you're actually looking, so the top of the map is west and so on. But what's important in here are the dots represent 100, as it says in 1934, Negro residents. So what you're seeing is where Black residents lived in St. Louis in the 1930s. And that's a result primarily of where people moved into the city and some other processes we'll talk about. Some other things to think about are you're seeing in here several parks. So there's Carondelet Park on the south, Tower Grove Park, Forest Park, Fairgrounds Park, O'Fallon Park, and then Bell Fountain and Calvary Cemeteries. And these are important as landmarks because they're large green spaces in the city of St. Louis. Now, to understand why the 1934 map looks the way it does, you need to understand that St. Louis has a unique spot in history of being one of the very few cities who actually tried to legalize segregation. And in 1916, the city of St. Louis held a referendum which legally adopted segregation in terms of where Black residents and white residents could live. And this was passed in 1916 and it was overturned within the next year. So within basically a year, the Supreme Court overturned it and said that you can't have a law that legally segregates where people live in the city. So that was passed in 1916, overturned in 1917. However, that didn't change the efforts to restrict where people of color could live, where Black people could live, and also Jewish people and other groups. So here you're seeing a map that shows those same green spaces. And now it shows a process called Restrictive Covenants. So the next sort of step in how St. Louis tried to restrict where people lived was by looking at restricting this through trying to put covenants on leases and deeds of property. So if you bought a house in St. Louis and the neighborhoods that are shown in black, you often had a covenant in there that said you would not sell your house to a person who was Black, Jewish, and so on. And the idea of this, if you look at sort of the map and think about where the Black community was in the 1930s, was to restrict the Black community from moving out of that central part of the city that would be basically between Broadway and Kings Highway. So, and then east and west of Cass and Choteau. So the idea was to restrict where people lived. And so these covenants kind of were boxing the Black community. Now, this was overturned in the 1940s with a case called Shelley versus Kramer. And this case, again, was a Supreme Court decision that overturned restrictive covenants around this house. And this was the person who was the plaintiff in the lawsuit. So other things, however, tended to maintain still where Black people could live and restricted how people had access to land and so on. And these are more federal policies now. So we have something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, urban renewal, and public housing. And those three things are all tied in with federal legislation in the 1930s and 1940s. So first, this is that same perspective map looking at, in this case, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And this was a loan corporation set up during the Depression to allow homeowners to have access to money to get a home loan. And part of what this involved, though, was that in each city, the people who worked for Homeowners Loan Corporation had to make assessments about the risk of the loans. So if you look at the bottom where they show the legend for the map, they show first grade, second grade, third grade, and fourth grade. And those different colors, the green, blue, yellow, and red, reflect the level of risk. So red was the greatest risk and green was the least risk. And again, you see that where the red areas are tended to be, again, the place where most of the Black community in St. Louis, as well as poor whites as well, but primarily the Black community in St. Louis lived. And so again, what that meant was it was difficult for people to obtain home loans. It was difficult for people to improve property and so on. And that led to, in part, some of the next federal interventions you're going to see and how they were applied in St. Louis. And this related to urban renewal. And you're seeing here a picture on the left of Mayor Cervantes, who was one of the mayors of St. Louis in the 50s, looking at a place called Mill Creek Valley, which is essentially that corridor where most of the Black community lived in the 1950s. And on the right side is a picture of the urban renewal project just after that. And for the people who've been in St. Louis, this area is now where Interstate 64 goes through downtown. And then the area that was cleared is sort of by where St. Louis University and Harris-Stowe State University and other places are. But they had a huge urban renewal project in this area that had become very impoverished, and which led to really the start of white flight in St. Louis and a lot of change in land use to the north of this area. So also in the 1950s, under the Federal Housing Act, the city of St. Louis started constructing public housing. This is now in what would be north of Del Mar. This area was the Pruitt-Igoe Housing Project, which was built in 1952 and then torn down in 1972. But there was large public housing, so you can catch the contrast between the housing that remained and then the new housing that was built. And although this new housing was initially very popular, one of the outcomes was it started this process of white flight. So part of what this process meant was that as white residents started leaving north part of St. Louis, North St. Louis, where Pruitt-Igoe was, as white residents started leaving, there's a process where there's a relatively rapid change over 20 years. So this is from the book I mentioned at the start of the talk, and they're showing or Gordon's book, and he's showing here the change in a single property. So it shows one property in 1940 when a homeowner purchased in 1940, 0.32% of the neighborhood was Black. And then when he sold the property in 1960, the block was 87% Black. So this process of having this really rapid change of within North City from being essentially exclusively white neighborhood to becoming predominantly Black neighborhood happened over about a 20-year period. So this led in part this rapid transformation, people moving into housing, that was often overvalued, and a whole range of processes and the continuing process of flight of first white residents and now Black residents has led to the decline and abandonment of much of North City. So, for example, the two neighborhoods we're looking at in Baden, 92%, which is on the top image, 92% of the residents are Black. There's $29,000 median income. 11% of the lots are vacant. And in Wells Goodfellow, 30% of the lots are vacant. So you're seeing that a lot of this green in here represents tree cover, but also a lot of this represents actual vacant lots where houses have been torn down. So this place, Wells Goodfellow and Baden, are the place we're looking at, and we're interested in trying to understand birds and kind of the context of what are birds and bird habitat in places where people live in these two neighborhoods, and then opportunity for conservation. So this is tied in with the Green City Coalition Plan, which again, I mentioned at the start of the talk, and the idea is to take many of the vacant lots and make them into spaces like this. Now, I'll say honestly that this particular area they're showing is one of the really large lots, and it's an area where essentially an entire city block has been torn down, and so this is not the typical type of management they're proposing for the entire area, but it just shows sort of the schematic and the approach that the city's taking and how they're doing some of their planning. So our first part of our project really was to look at birds and bird habitat, and the grad student involved with this is Sebastian Moreno, who is now actually working on his PhD at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. But this gives you an idea of the kinds of places that are common in Wells Goodfellow and in Baden, and they show sort of the range of vacant lots and vacant homes and so on. So you see that there are lots which where essentially vegetation has taken over the lot. There are lots where they're being maintained and cleared, and there are actual houses which are abandoned but still standing. So one of the things that we started with was to really try to get a handle on what land cover looks like with these vacant lots, and to understand what the neighbors look like in terms of vacant land. And because vacant land is such an important part of these two neighborhoods, we structured our study to try to look at birds not in vacant lots, but in areas where they had different amounts of vacancies. So Sebastian did bird counts on 1 hectare study areas that were stratified based on the amount of vacant land in the 1 hectare. So to give you again an idea of vacancy, this just shows again what these areas that were vacant look like. And you see that again, many of the lots were mowed, but they have lots of artificial surface. They often have significant amount of tree cover and so on. So it just gives you an idea of what these lots look like. Now, so Sebastian did his counts in 2017 and 2018, and he did them on 1 hectare lots or 1 hectare plots, centered on residential streets, and he assessed habitat in both the yards and the lots. And one of his questions he was really interested in is does vacancy really influence what the bird communities look like? So if there's more vacant land in a neighborhood, do people encounter maybe different groups of species and so on along the streets and so on? Okay, so what he found was there were 53 species among the two neighborhoods. Again, the 5 common species were sort of typical what you might expect in many older residential neighborhoods in cities of the United States. But he also found that, to answer that sort of second question, that the places that tended to have more vacant land within that 1 hectare had things like dick thistles, red-winged blackbird, cedar waxwings, northern flicker. So they had some different bird species associated with where there's more vacant land. Looking at what actually we're in now within those 1 hectare study areas, again, he found that as far as the ground cover, that there was a lot of artificial surface, lots of mowed lawn, and then sort of moderate amounts of shrub cover and tree cover. So what this kind of means is that, again, you're seeing a typical urban bird community, but it might be modified by presence of tree cover and shrub cover, and also in some cases where they're planning on putting in more prairie or grassland vegetation, not a grassland other than lawns. So it means that managing vegetation might have some impact on what kinds of birds people are seeing in the neighborhood. Now, the second part though of the project was really to look at trying to understand what all of this about birds means, and it means actually to the residents, and what this larger idea about nearby nature means to the residents. So again, the city has had, through the Green City Coalition, a planning process to talk about green infrastructure, particularly greening and stormwater management. And this planning process has involved residents, and I have a question mark, but they actually have made a very strong effort to involve local residents. So the residents have been involved in discussions about planning, about the different specific management activities, a whole range of opportunities for input. And so here you're seeing one of the neighborhood meetings in Wells Goodfellow, where they're describing what would be going on in the neighborhood. And Drew Malinak, who's in this slide, who now works for DJ Case and Associates out in Indiana, was involved in doing a qualitative research looking at how people perceive vacant lots and their views about wildlife and wildlife habitat and management of these lots. So Drew did a series of interviews with about 28 people in Wells Goodfellow and Baden, and he talked about, or he found, a number of themes that tied in with perception of wildlife, vegetation and wildlife habitat, and then vacant lots and uses. So his basic model said that people's perceptions of their preferences for vacant lot management were based on their perceptions of wildlife and habitat and vegetation. And those were really shaped by these 4 different themes that Drew identified: community change, safety, neighborhood care, and maintenance effort. All these are going to relate to both what Sebastian found with birds and the preferences of how the lots might be managed. And I'm going to focus on community change and safety to give you an idea of some of these findings. So to put in perspective who Drew talked with, most of the residents he talked with were homeowners who have been active in the discussions around the green infrastructure projects with the Green City Coalition. So the people he talked with were typically folks who would be in their late 50s and up, many of whom grew up in Wells Goodfellow or Baden or North City in the 1960s and 1970s. So typically these would have been the people who were children of folks who moved into North City in the 1950s, and then they grew up in the 1970s. So typically a lot of the people that Drew interviewed had told a common story. They said, I grew up in North City, and I went to school here, graduated from high school, some people went to college, they got jobs. A lot of people said, I moved somewhere else in St. Louis City or St. Louis County, and then my parents died, and I didn't want to see the house, abandoned. I weren't able to sell it, so I decided to buy the house and move back. So a lot of people moved back into the house and moved into a relative's house. And the first thing they talked about was, they said, it wasn't like this when I was growing up. They said, when I grew up, there were stores up and down the street on Del Mar. St. Louis Avenue had all these stores. We were in a really nice blue collar neighborhood. Kids played on the streets. There were neighborhood schools. All these things, people talked a lot about that. So the first thing that really came up was that people's perceptions of wildlife and wildlife habitat are very much being shaped by this idea of this negative community change. And we heard over and over that, I moved back to this neighborhood and now my house is the only one on the block. Or they tore down 5 houses across the street. So this idea that these neighborhoods are really changing and it's been a negative change was a very strong part of this narrative. Now, tied in with this was that many people viewed wildlife and wildlife habitat as being a negative sign of community change. So we heard people say, the only time I see wildlife is when I see a raccoon coming out of the roof of a house, or the only time I see it is when I see a coyote on a vacant lot. So a lot of people talked about this idea of loss, abandonment, and neglect, and they tended to view vegetation and wildlife as being a sort of visible symbol of that. So when people say, this vacant lot looks overgrown, it's weedy, and they say this looks just, and when they show me pictures of the pocket prairies, they look just like this vacant lot with all this junk on it. So there's this very strong sense that community change has led to neglect of the neighborhood, and vegetation and wildlife are being viewed as part of that. The second area that came up a lot was discussion about safety. And safety in this case meant to some extent people's feelings of being safe within their neighborhood, but it also led very much to people's views about being safe in their interactions with police. As many of you know, when you hear about places like Ferguson in St. Louis, this is a 10-minute drive from Wells Goodfellow. So these places in North City are inside the city of St. Louis, and like Ferguson, but many of the issues about policing and safety and all these are kind of tied together. So one of the issues that came up a lot with safety was the idea that the police were not responding to residents' concerns about vacant land. And they said typically that vacant land were places where people often see minor crimes, things like kids drinking in the vacant lots, some more major crimes like prostitution, drug use, drug dealing, all these kind of things often were tied to these vacant spaces. So residents talked a lot about the idea that these places weren't safe, but also that the city wasn't responding to their needs. And again, this had an influence on how people viewed vegetation and wildlife. So this idea that these places are not safe because of the kind of species where people see coyotes and they say, okay, I'm concerned about that. They say, okay, the trees are places people can hide behind. Vegetation often screens the lot from public use so people can't see it. I'm sorry, from public view so people can't see what happens in there. And then finally, the city's responsible for this because they're not maintaining the lots. So again, a lot of the ideas about the value of these places were being shaped by the idea that these places weren't safe, that vegetation and wildlife is tied in with that, and the city has been responsive to people's concerns. So this led to a broader set of concerns, which also emerged during the interviews, which sort of titled these themes together. First, a theme that the city's given up on North City, and that they really don't care about the current residents, and that they just assume condemn houses, tear them down, not have them built, and so on, and not rebuild. Tied in with that also is an idea about gentrification, and there's a concern that the really nice things proposed with green infrastructure projects are an effort to change who lives there. And many people said, what the city really wants to do is get rid of Black people. They want to make the neighborhood wealthier. And people say, you can see this happening on the other side of Del Mar and those kind of things. But in general, there were mixed reactions to the Green City Coalition, that people liked the broader idea of really doing something with the lots. Most people recognize that Wells Goodfellow and Baden will not be like they were 60 years ago, and they recognize that, but they're still concerned about motives and about the actual practices taking place. Okay, so what people identified as being places that they valued were places that the lots could be placed for community gardens, that they could be placed for recreation exercise, that they could be places like West County, and West County is the wealthiest part of the St. Louis metro area, and then also places that enhance the neighborhood, and then places that are useful. So people talked about places where kids can play, places where kids can learn about nature. So they talked about very much the kinds of places they like, but this picture would be typical of what many people told Drew they would like to see. So these more open park-like places, and but they talked a lot about the kinds of wildlife they see in those places. They like seeing birds and so on. So these management preferences very clearly could encompass what Sebastian's finding as being some of the species that occur in the neighborhood. So in terms of our conclusions, what we found first, we found that from an environmental justice perspective, that there's a legacy of change in North City that drives how people view conservation efforts, and that also drives the actual sort of physical landscape they're seeing. and nearby nature relates to the context in which residents view and perceive vacant lots in St. Louis City. And which again is kind of filters that environmental justice factors as well. And then finally, the popular values that people have these very mixed experiences, and that simply saying that green infrastructure is going to be great because it's going to have these conservation and ecosystem service benefits doesn't necessarily match with what people actually experience with some of the issues around concerns about safety and being managed about and being reminded about community decline and so on. And so how all this ties together is that in terms of management and conservation planning, I think what Green City Coalition is finding is that as they've gone through this process, Wells Goodfellow is the first neighborhood they worked with. Baden they worked at the same time, but has a very different history. And also they paid people to tear down houses in Baden. So there's a very different kind of legacy in Baden around Green City Coalition. And then the other neighbors they're starting to work with now have had increasing amounts of community engagement and really trying to get more input from residents on what they want early on. So to tie this together and kind of end on this and sort of how we've been working with this, Drew and Sebastian participated in some work the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing through the Urban Wildlife Conservation Program and the Urban Bird Treaty Program, of which St. Louis is part. And so Drew and Sebastian have made a webinar about their findings and some of their measurement recommendations, things like that, which are available. And if you Google Finding Common Ground, Managing Vacant Lots for Birds and People in St. Louis, you can find out more about that. And I want to acknowledge in this talk really the opportunity to do this was provided by Green City Coalition, and really their enthusiasm and excitement and help in doing this, because in many ways it sounds some ways like this is a criticism of what they're doing, but they've really been very responsive to residents. They've been responsive, I think, to the city, to our work and so on. Drew Malinak and Sebastian Moreno are the graduates of the project. Andrew Hurley and Bob Pierce are collaborators with me, and we all were part of the National Science Foundation's Missouri EPSCoR grant, which actually funded all of this work and to look at how Missouri cities can be more resilient to climate change. And that's part of what this project was about. And with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Charlie.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure there would be a bunch of applause if we could in this virtual setting. First question. First question comes from David. Does the city own all the vacant lots? Are there other owners? And what are the priorities of the owners? Okay, so that's an excellent question. So the lots that are in Green City Coalition are all owned by the St. Louis Development Corporation. So the St. Louis Development Corporation is part of the city of St. Louis, and they are charged with disposing of vacant lots. So their role is supposed to be to figure out other uses for vacant lots. And the reason I say there's sort of two answers to that is that there are some lots, so private owned, so you can acquire a vacant lot, and I think some of the lots that people own are in some of these Green City Coalition lots. So there are a variety of ways you can purchase a lot next to your house. You can get loans to do it. There are a variety of mechanisms for doing that. So, but in practice, they always start out being owned by the city. So typically they're properties where people defaulted from they didn't pay their taxes and the city seized the property. That's very interesting. A question from Steve Strauss. In short, are natural areas more feared than valued where there is lots of property? Hi, Steve. I know Steve from grad school, so that's another thing. But anyway,
So I think to be clear, I've been involved in another project in North City, which really deals with some places which are more sort of natural areas, particularly ones along the Mississippi River. And so in North City, and I think the best way to answer that would be to say that I think a lot of this is pretty context dependent, because when you go to, say, this place is called the North Riverfront Trail, which is along the Mississippi River and maybe 3 or 4 miles east of Wells Goodfellows and some of those places along the river. I'm sure some of these same people ride bikes along there, walk along there, and it's a much sort of more remote setting. But I think a lot of where the fear comes in is tied in a lot with issues about crime and issues about sort of public safety. And I think a lot of it, I think especially the sort of wildlife side, but I think a lot of it is more people saying those species don't belong here because this is a neighborhood. So I'm going to duck out of my picture, but this picture up here is actually from New Orleans. It's from the ESA field trip we did a couple years in New Orleans, but it gives you the idea that a lot of these lots are literally right between houses. So there may be a house, there's a vacant house next to it, and then there are 2 lots. So a lot of these are right next to this. So many of the comments people had said, people say, I don't care what Green City Coalition says, I just don't like this next to my house. And so I think a lot of the response was people saying that, when you talk about a pocket prairie and it's next to my house, it still looks like a weedy lot. So it was that kind of response. So I guess to answer your question, I think that probably there may be views that may transfer to other natural areas, but I think in this case, a lot of it really is the setting. Whereas if you go to along Riverfront Trail, where the city's done restoration work and things like that, and some of the larger parks where they've done some of this, I think they're pretty actively used, and people sort of say, oh, okay, it's supposed to look like this because it's more wild or more, except, it's a different setting.
Another question from Jared Freeman. Are there similar community interactions with vacant natural spaces in other cities?
Yeah, I'll mention, Christine Riga Brodsky, who now is faculty member at Pittsburgh State, was a PhD student at Missouri and worked with me, and she actually has several publications that are out on her work on vacant lots and birds and bird habitat. And also Ela Carpenter, who just finished her PhD, worked on bats and vacant lands. And I think what they both found, I think first they found a very similar setup from Baltimore about the creation of a lot of the vacant lands. Baltimore and St. Louis have a lot of similarities. And I think that where the lots came from kind of are similar, sort of the origin. I think that Baltimore also has a sort of plan for managing vacant lots and conservation opportunities. I think they've had more, some of the same concerns by residents. I think that in some cases, Baltimore's had a little more success because I think that where the lots are and sort of the locations where the lots are and where people live and that kind of thing is a little bit different. So I think that they've had more success in Baltimore, maybe with some of the conservation activities, and definitely I think with a little more engagement and with people in terms of creating different kinds of spaces. Well, having said that, I think some of the things the Green City Coalition have been very active in really doing some very community-based efforts. Like they did a history, they put up historical sign around where the streetcar loop used to be, and which was done with, there's a liquor store there called Belt Loop Liquor, which apparently is a very well-known community institution. I didn't go into, both my grad students went into and said it's a very good, but it's a liquor store where the owner's really been acting in the community for years, and it's right by where the trolley loop was, where the streetcars turned around. And the landowner worked with the city to get the State Historical Society to put up a sign about the Belt Loop. And there's a lot of people came out for that because people said, I remember the Holding streetcar when I was a little kid, because it was the last streetcar line in St. Louis. And, so they had a lot of involvement that way. But I think Baltimore probably has a little more going on. And there we found probably hundreds of papers about vacant lots and wildlife. There's a lot of work in New Orleans, sort of post-Katrina looking at this. So I think, and all these have some themes which are common, but some which are very, very different from each city.
We have another question that asks, how can this work be done while addressing real concerns about gentrification?
Okay, that's a good question. So I'll kind of answer from the St. Louis perspective. So one thing going on in St. Louis, which kind of I think fuels some of this, is that in St. Louis, there's a developer who actually was from North City. Originally, he happened to be white, but he grew up in North City in the 50s. And he was essentially land banking. He went in and bought hundreds of properties and was just holding on to them. And so it was rumored that, so there were all kinds of rumors about what that was about. And one of the things that was tied in with that was that St. Louis is building now, so the Defense Mapping Agency, which is one of the federal agencies, they do all the GIS work basically for the Army and Air Force and all that, and they are in St. Louis, and they built a new campus in, not really in North City, but kind of east of where all this is. And so that's an area where the city is hoping, it's where the Pruitt-Igoe housing project was near there. And what they're hoping to do is really use that as a boom for development. And that area is close to downtown. It's an area where probably if you're going to gentrify, that would actually be it, because it's close to downtown. You can walk downtown from there. Defense mapping is kind of going to be north of it. So the idea was to think this area between where the Defense Mapping Agency is and downtown will become this big boom, maybe. But so that's going on. So I think a lot of residents, especially the Wells Goodfellow folks who are near light rail line, they're near I-70, and I think a lot of people that are really nervous saying, hey, they could really work with their neighborhood. What Green City Coalition has done is they've tried pretty consciously to really make this a very neighborhood-focused project. So they've done a lot, like I mentioned, they did the thing with the belt loop and all this. They've really tried to, I think, identify local concerns and really try to address those. And they've tried to really talk about sense of place throughout the neighborhood. And I think the other thing I think they've tried to really emphasize, especially in Wells Goodfellow, is that Wells Goodfellow, and I think the residents recognize this as well, is a place where probably they're not as accessible to, it's not a place where it's not near downtown. It's not really a place that probably the people who might go come in and say really raise property value so you couldn't afford to live it, that's probably not where they would be moving. So I think that they've done that. But definitely with some of it, there's that concern among residents. And I think especially among people who are homeowners and they're trying to maintain the value of their home and that kind of stuff and want to stay there.
Bill Girth says, thanks for a great presentation. I grew up in the St. Louis area and still did not know all that history. Do you think improving the safety in these areas is essential to allow residents to appreciate nearby nature?
I think it really is. I mean, I think addressing that, and I know the Green City Coalition people said they were a little surprised by that, but I think they said within some of their staff said they really weren't. And I think what it ties into is that, yeah, I think it's especially the idea about people's perception of how the city serves them. And it's the police, I think, get a lot of it, but it's also the city. I mean, one thing that they talked about was they said that, so if you're from St. Louis, know that the forestry department for the city is supposed to maintain vacant lots. And they said often they don't do that. And so there's a lot of this is really tied in with concerns about the city. And so what's supposed to have a Green City Coalition is they're supposed to be taking over responsibility for management of all the lots. That's supposed to be part of all this urban vitality and ecology project. So the idea is that by having a little different focus on vacant land, they'll be able to address a lot of these concerns more directly. And especially in neighborhoods where they have a lot of vacancies. So the ones they're talking about are by so Wells Goodfellow, that's right by Wellston, it's by the Wellston Metrolink stop. It's inside the city. And then Baden's way north. And the other ones are Walnut, Walnut Park, Walnut Hill, something like that, which is over by O'Fallon Park. And so some other neighbors, and they've been more successful because I think they've been able to really learn from the other two neighborhoods, and they've been able to actually try to address a lot of these issues. So they are looking at safety. They're looking at a lot of the concerns people have about how they manage the loss. Like they're saying, they've tried to go in and like they're cutting down trees. If the trees are along the street on the lot, they'll cut the trees down. If they're along the side of the lot, they leave them standing. And the idea is that for the vacant lots, if you can see through the end of the lot, that makes people a lot more comfortable. So they're trying to do things like that. Although the Green City folks said they're also let's just cut down all the trees. So that's not quite working, I think, the way they intended. But those are some of the things they're trying to do.
Paul Mayer says, I'm intrigued that stormwater management factors significantly in the development of the vacant green space. Does the city have a comprehensive plan to utilize the vacant lots for stormwater?
Yes, so very quickly they do. And so very quickly, that's really what's driving this. So this is a result of St. Louis City and St. Louis County being out of compliance with EPA, and it was part of their consent agreement with EPA to settle, I guess, I don't think it's the right term, but to settle whatever penalties EPA had. So they're doing this to reduce non-point, non-point pollution, but also stormwater, and particularly trying to address the fact they have a lot of combined sewer overflows. So the money for this came initially from a sales tax that Metropolitan Sewer District put in. So if you live in St. Louis City or St. Louis County, you pay a sewer tax. You don't pay a water bill, you pay a sewer tax, which is kind of interesting, but you pay that. And so they had an increase in that. And they've done two things. The first thing they did, was supposed to, the model for all of these was they bought houses that were having problems with flooding from combined sewer overflows. And so, for example, in the Baden neighborhood, they went in and bought up several properties and actually put in a lot of the green infrastructure improvement there. So actually in Baden, people really liked a lot of this because, you know, the people who were having problems were able to sell their house and actually buy a different house. The residents liked because they have green space and so on. But all of these are tied in with stormwater structures. And as an aside, the residents actually like the stormwater structures because I didn't put a picture in this talk, but Drew said that he showed people pictures of different features of different lots. And he said one that people really liked were the fenced stormwater structures because people said, you know, it's green, there's water there sometimes, and no one can get in. And so people really like that. And so, but all of these have stormwater features.
Another question from Julian. Have you found that citizens in the city, have they tried to make individual efforts to try and help with these vacant lots?
Yes, they do. They have a couple of programs. There's one called Mow to Own. There's one called Rent to Own. And both of these are ones that are in place with St. Louis Development Corporation. And so what they can do is residents can go in and they can kind of lease the lot. And if they make improvements over so many years, they can get a low interest loan to buy the lot. I think a lot of people do that. We heard from what Drew heard in his interviews, and also what Andrew Hurley, who is at the University of Missouri St. Louis, did a lot of research in these neighborhoods as well. He mentioned this, that a lot of residents said, and the Green City Coalition group said this as well, that just the bureaucracy of dealing with the city around trying to get access to manage a lot of the paperwork, all that kind of stuff. A lot of people have said they just go and just mow it. So a lot of these lots, I'm, just from seeing these and hearing Drew and Sebastian talk with residents, I think a lot of people just say, a couple people on the block get together, we're just going to mow the lot, so they'll mow it, and they take care of those. We've had people, they have gardens. A lot of people garden in them. There are a lot of activities in there. If people have chairs in there, they do all kinds of things. And one thing Christine found in Baltimore as well was that a lot of people, they use them different ways. there are paths through them. People cut through there. They walk their dogs in there. They do all kinds of things. So I think the lots get a lot of use, and they also, and I think people are actively sort of managing some of them. So people mow. They have community gardens, like I said. So it's a real mix. Some of the areas, the big issue I think they face in Wells Goodfellow is they have places where the entire city block is vacant. And those are a lot more of a challenge. So there might be maybe one house and then the entire rest of the block is vacant. And they have a lot of places where there's still vacant, like, again, the picture behind me is a different city, but the boarded up houses are a big deal. And that's the same thing in St. Louis. So people are in there, people come in and strip out all the copper and everything, and people are squatting inside and all kinds of stuff. So there are a lot of issues which kind of compound just managing the lots.
All right, I think with that, we're right at 5 o'clock. So I wanted to thank you, Dr. Nilon, for giving this wonderful presentation and seminar for the EEBCB seminar series.
Thank you.
Next week, we have Andy C. Coming from, I think, the University of California in Davis. I'm not sure. So yeah, please join us for next week's seminar. And if anybody would like to stay on, we will be making attendees into panelists so they can talk with Dr. Nilon.
Okay.
All right, I guess we can all applaud now, right?
Thank you.
That's the hardest thing about these things, is just showing, energy and excitement.
Yeah.
For what's presented. So
I am busily promoting people who I know are not. What are those people called who put really bad stuff on Zoom?
I know what you mean. Yeah.
So if I know who you are, I'm promoting you to a panelist, but it's taking a while. I think probably several of us are doing it. Charlie, I really enjoyed your talk.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, I can answer one question. I was just looking at the questions. So Eric, I don't know if Eric is still on, but he asked about our there are tree deficient neighborhoods, and was that before or after urban renewal and white flag? And I think some of it's just a kind of I think some of it's just a consequence. A lot of it's urban renewal, and I think just the city not being really active. Again, City Forestry Department in St. Louis is actually they have a pretty good urban forestry program, and I think some of this is just they haven't been keeping up with replacing trees, and I think some of that's because if no one's living there, they aren't coming out. They're getting the calls to replace the trees and that kind of thing. So I think some of that with the tree is sort of some of that. And they ask about good vegetation, whether of a tree canopy. Yeah, we did have people talk a lot about what it used to look like with the trees and that kind of thing. And the big thing a lot of people talked about were trees. And in Wells Goodfellow, there's a park called Barrett Brothers Park, which is sort of a local park. And apparently that's one that the city's done some work to rehabilitate. So a lot of people said, oh, we like what they did in Barrett Brothers Park and that kind of thing. So people talk about that as an example of them kind of bringing it back to what it looked like when they were kids, and people talked about, oh, I like taking my grandkids there, that kind of thing. And then the other one, how can you ask about green space, about property values? And yeah, we heard about property values a lot. So where people talked about the property values were, again, to give you a little perspective of who the residents were, almost all the